On my cold and quiet Christmas morning in London, 1872, the streets of Bloomsbury lay wrapped in a brittle hush, broken only by the distant sound of church bells and the soft crunch of footsteps on frost-hardened stone. It was a day meant for joy, for warmth, for feasting and firelight, yet inside a modest lodging-house at No. 2's Great Coram Street, darkness had already taken root. As the city's wealthier residents raised glasses and carved roasts, the landlady of the establishment, Mrs. Harriet Wright, stood rigid at the threshold of a closed door, her knuckles white as she rapped once more. "Miss Buzzwell, Miss Buzzwell, are you quite well?" No answer came, only the dull echo of her own voice, swallowed by the silence inside. She had seen the young woman return the night before, Christmas Eve, her cheeks flushed with the cold, a gentleman at her side. They vanished behind the door. But now nearly half a day had passed, and no one had seen or heard from her since. The air was thick with something unnamed, intuition perhaps, or a primitive warning that something inside that room had gone terribly wrong. The door was locked. Oddly, the key was missing. A strange detail. The lock, though clearly secured from the outside, suggested finality. Mrs. Wright fetched help, and together they forced the door. The wood gave way with a sharp crack, splinters flying like shrapnel. Then it swung open with a long, low groan. What they saw inside would become etched into their minds like a brand. Harriet Buzzwell lay sprawled on the narrow bed, her body grotesquely twisted, the sheets beneath her soaked a deep and terrible red. Her throat had been slashed so savagely that the blade had met bone. Her handprint, bloody, desperate, marked her own forehead, as though frozen in a final moment of agony and resistance. It was not a burglary. There was no sign of struggle in the room beyond the killing itself. No valuables had been taken. Nothing appeared overturned. The door, locked from the outside, suggested she'd been trapped, or worse, delivered. A ritual, a message, or just a brutal end to a life already marked by hardship. Harriet Buzzwell, also known by her stage names Clara Burton and Clara Bruton, had spent her short, weary life straddling two worlds. By day, she was a ballet dancer at the opulent Alhambra Theatre, gracing the stage under gaslight and illusion, but the audience never saw the shadows that clung to her steps. Behind the feathers and rouge, she was a woman adrift in a city that chewed up and swallowed the weak. Born around 1845 and the flat fenlands of Wisbech, Cambridgeshire, Harriet came to London like so many others before her, young, poor, and dreaming. But dreams were expensive in the city, and her reality was one of scraping and scrambling. Her rent was often overdue. She borrowed coins when she could. She repaid them when fortune smiled. On the very night of her murder, she returned with a glint of hope in her eye, having somehow procured enough money to settle her debt to Mrs. Wright. 9 shillings, paid with a half-sovereign. And yet, just hours later, she was dead. It wasn't only the dance or the debts that weighed on her. There was a deeper duty, a secret not carried lightly. Harriet was the mother of a little girl 8 years, Kate, a child who, by all accounts, she loved fiercely, but could seldom afford to care for. Friends said she worked harder than any of them, and it was true, because in the shadows of the stage, away from the velvet curtains and polite applause, Harriet did what many women of her station were forced to do. She sold her company. Not proudly, perhaps not even regularly, but necessity often wears a cruel mask. In Victorian London, the line between performance and survival was razor thin, and society's judgment, when it came, was swift and merciless. To understand what happened to Harriet Buzzwell, one must peel back the heavy curtain of Victorian respectability and peer into the underbelly of the empire. A woman's role in that world was rigidly defined: piety, purity, domesticity. A man navigated business, law, and governance. A woman remained within the sanctity of the home, a moral beacon for the family. Step beyond those boundaries, and she became something else entirely. A deviant, a danger, a felon woman. Victorian London was a city that teetered on a tightrope between propriety and perversion. By official count, there were over 8 prostitutes in the city. The historians believed the true number was closer to 80, an ocean of foreign women surviving on the margins. Dancers, actresses, widows, washerwomen. They were not all seductresses or criminals. Many were mothers, many were desperate. And Harriet was one of them. Her lives were lived in the gaps of society's conscience, their bodies sold in shadowy doorways while the city above them dined in gaslit splendor. When one of them was murdered, the reaction was often muted, curiosity perhaps, but rarely outrage, not unless the crime was too gruesome to ignore, and in Harriet's case it was. As the investigation began, whispers filled the streets. Who was the man seen with her on Christmas Eve? Why had the door been locked from the outside? Why leave the body in such a theatrical pose? Was it a crime of passion or punishment? The police combed through the meager evidence, questioned neighbors, scoured taverns. Yet no arrest was ever made, no suspect ever charged. Her murder became just another unsolved mystery. But for those who looked closer, there were clues not of who did it, but of why. A society that condemned women like Harriet to the edge, then acted shocked when they were swallowed by darkness. A justice system that moved mountains for the wealthy but barely stirred for the poor. And a city that wore its grandeur like a mask, beneath which beat a heart of cruelty and contradiction. Harriet's story didn't end with her death. Her daughter Kate vanished from the public record shortly after the murder. No formal guardianship, no known relatives, just a name fading into silence. The Alhambra Theatre continued its performances, dancers came and went, and London carried on as it always did. But on certain nights, when the fog rolls heavy through Bloomsbury and the gas lamps flicker against the cold, the story of Number 2's Great Coram Street stirs again. A woman silenced not only by the blade, but by a world that never truly listened. A world that still doesn't. The days following Harriet Buzzwell's murder unfolded like a funeral dirge played in reverse. Quiet at first, then rising in pitch as horror gave way to scandal and speculation. The newspapers pounced on the story, hungry for sensation and ever eager to feed the public's morbid appetite. But they didn't call her by her name. Not always. They called her the Christmas Murder Girl, or worse, the dancing harlot of Great Coram Street. Her art, her labor, her daughter, erased beneath headlines that reduced her to a caricature of moral failure. This, more than anything, revealed the brutal lens through which Victorian society viewed women like Harriet. Her death was no longer a tragedy. It was theater, and the audience wanted blood. The coroner's inquest was swift yet unsettling. Testimonies were collected, evidence reviewed, theories aired like dirty laundry. It was noted that the door had been locked from the outside and the key removed, an unmistakable sign of premeditation. But still, no suspect, no definitive witness, only fragments. One dancer said Harriet had feared someone, a gentleman known only as Mr. Charles, who had been seen attending her performances and leaving her gifts. Another suggested it was a jealous rival. A third swore she saw a man in a dark coat standing outside the lodging house late that Christmas Eve, watching, always watching. But none of these leads led anywhere, and over time the fog of forgetfulness began to settle in. Yet something in the case refused to fade entirely. Perhaps it was the way her body had been left, deliberately posed as if her death had meaning beyond violence. Perhaps it was the timing. Christmas, a day of rebirth and sanctity, turned instead into a scene of ritual and blood. Or perhaps it was the eerie parallels to a string of unsolved killings that would rock London just 16 years later. For those paying attention, the murder of Harriet Buzzwell bore haunting echoes of another series of crimes, those committed by a phantom who would come to be known as Jack the Ripper. The similarities were uncanny. A woman of the streets, throat slashed with precision, little sign of struggle, a body positioned with dark intentionality. Even the geography was eerily close. Bloomsbury, only a stone's throw from Whitechapel. It made some wonder, had the Ripper's rage begun earlier than believed? Had his first victim been a forgotten dancer? discarded by history before the world was ready to reckon with the monster in its midst? The police, of course, dismissed such speculation. Different time, different method, they insisted. But that certainty has not aged well. Others saw something even darker beneath the surface. Not just murder, but message. Some theorized that Harriet's killing was the work of a secret society, a group known to have operated in London's underground during the 19th century. Men of power and influence, obsessed with ritual, anonymity, and dominion over the vulnerable. There were whispers of initiation rites involving women, symbols etched in blood and silence bought through coin or fear. The fact that her room was not ransacked and that the killer left no visible trail only fueled this theory. Had Harriet seen something she shouldn't have? Had she become collateral in a war of secrets that stretched beyond the lodging house, beyond the theater, into the very institutions meant to protect her? There is no proof, of course, only absence, but sometimes what is missing screams louder than what remains. Meanwhile, Harriet's life continued to unravel posthumously, exposed and dissected in courtrooms and columns. The Alhambra Theatre quickly replaced her, casting new dancers under brighter lights while never speaking her name again. Friends who once toasted to her performances now whispered in fear. A few claimed strange things began to happen in the theater's dressing rooms. Cold spots, vanishing items, the faint sound of a lullaby in the dead of night, dismissed as superstition, of course, but such stories often cling to places touched by death, especially unjust death, especially death denied its dignity. And then there was Kate, the girl Harriet left behind. Only 8 years old and now motherless in a city with little use for orphaned girls. She disappeared from official records soon after the murder, like breath fading from a mirror. No known adoption, no burial, no trace. It was as if she had never existed. Some say she was taken in by a friend of her mother's, raised in secret to avoid the stigma of her bloodline. Others believe she was placed in a workhouse, stripped of identity and folded into the machinery of Victorian poverty. The most unsettling theory, that she was taken, claimed by the very men who had silenced her mother, made into a pawn or a witness, or something worse. We will never know. And perhaps that is the cruelest cut of all. A child condemned to vanish in a city that already failed her. But Harriet's story doesn't just echo through police reports and newspaper clippings. It lingers in the bones of London itself, in the alleyways behind theaters where lamplight never quite reaches, in the rented rooms where dreams and dread sleep side by side, in the hidden histories of women who lived too loudly for their time and died too quietly for ours. Her case, though officially closed, refuses to settle. Amateur sleuths, historians, and writers still revisit the Coram Street crime, trying to tease meaning from its silence. Each decade adds another layer of theory, another shadow on the wall. Was it a crime of passion? A cover-up? The first ripple of something larger, more monstrous? We are left with only conjecture, and yet, in that uncertainty, a strange truth emerges. Harriet's life, her choices, her murder, none of it fit neatly into the categories Victorian England tried so hard to maintain. She was not merely a sinner or a saint, not simply a mother or a dancer or a victim. She was all of it. And that, perhaps, is why her story still unsettles us, because it reminds us that beneath every forgotten name is a life too complex to reduce, too human to erase. And so the house at number 12 Great Coram Street still stands. Its facade updated, its interiors changed. The bed is gone, the wallpaper replaced. But some say if you press your ear to the floorboards in the dead of night, you can still hear the faint echo of footsteps, a rustle of skirts, a whisper, not of fear, but of truth demanding to be remembered. Harriet Buzzwell was not just another victim. She was a mirror held up to a society that refused to see itself. And in that reflection, we glimpse the face of history, not as it was written, but as it was lived, raw, wounded, and waiting to be heard. But what truly haunts the legacy of Harriet Buzzwell is not the blade that ended her life, nor the faceless man who wielded it. It is the silence that followed, the kind of silence that swallows screams, the kind that spreads decade by decade until it becomes part of the architecture of forgetting. Harriet's death was officially closed as murder by person or persons unknown, a cold, bureaucratic phrase that feels as hollow now as it did then. It marked not only the end of her case, but the beginning of a long, deliberate erasure. In the years that followed, her name faded from police ledgers, legal documents, and public memory. No plaque was ever placed in her honor. No grave bears her story. Even historians for many decades passed over her tale as just another footnote in a time littered with violence and vice. But history has a strange way of refusing burial, and every so often, a forgotten voice claws its way back to the surface, pulling with it the questions no one wanted to ask. What if Harriet wasn't just a victim, but a symbol, a fracture in the Victorian mirror, revealing the twisted logic beneath the polished veneer? She was everything the era feared, a working-class woman, unwed, with a child, living independently, earning money through both performance and survival. In the eyes of polite society, her life alone was an affront. Her murder, then, was not just an act of brutality, it was a message, a warning to other women who dared to step outside the script. Stay silent. Stay obedient. Stay invisible. Or else. And the most chilling part? That message still resonates. Because long after the cobblestones of Great Coram Street dried of her blood, long after the stage lights at the Alhambra dimmed, the world remained more comfortable with her death than with her truth. Some modern researchers have tried to breathe life back into the case, reopening old files, poring over census records, digging into obscure theater programs and parish logs. A few even attempted to map out connections between Harriet and suspected Ripper victims, hoping to link her murder to the more infamous crimes that followed. But the trail remains maddeningly fragmented. Names shift, dates blur, whole years go missing. It's as though the record itself conspires against resolution. But perhaps the absence of answers is not the point. Perhaps the power of Harriet's story lies not in solving it, but in finally hearing it. In remembering what was deliberately forgotten. There is an undeniable emotional gravity to her final hours. Picture it. London wrapped in the hush of Christmas Eve, the cold air thick with coal smoke and candlelight. Harriet walks home with a man whose face we'll never know. Perhaps she thought he was kind, or perhaps she didn't have the luxury to care. Maybe he offered her money, or warmth, or simply a moment of quiet in a life filled with noise. She unlocks the door to her narrow room. She lays her half-sovereign on the table, settling her rent. Maybe she hums a tune from the last show she danced. Maybe she fingers a trinket her daughter gave her. And then, darkness. A hand over her mouth. A blade. A final gasp that no one hears. That scene, repeated endlessly in the minds of those who study her, still has the power to gut you. Because it's not just Harriet, it's the echo of thousands of women like her who lived and died beneath history's radar, too inconvenient to celebrate, too complicated to mourn. In that sense, she becomes more than herself. She becomes a vessel for all the women whose stories ended in silence, who walked alone down unlit streets, who trusted the wrong face, who were told their lives didn't matter, but they did. And they do. In recent years, there has been a slow, tentative reclamation of these forgotten lives. Scholars, artists, even descendants of Victorian-era working-class families have begun to speak their names again. Memorial projects have risen across London, not grand monuments, but subtle, defiant gestures. A street sign, a palm in a window, a dancer performing barefoot in a shadowed alley, whispering Harriet's name into the dusk. And in this quiet resurrection, we begin to see history not as a monolith, but as a mosaic, fragile, fractured, and incomplete unless we restore the pieces deliberately left out. And yet, even now, Harriet's death resists closure. No arrest, no confession, no justice, just questions, floating like soot in the air. Why that night? Why that method? Why her? Some have turned to spiritualism for answers, claiming to feel Harriet's presence in the old theater cellars or in the halls of her former home. One psychic claimed she saw a vision of a masked gentlemen's club, a place where powerful men dabbled in occult rituals and left no trace. Another claimed to have heard Harriet say, "He promised me I'd be safe." But even these ghost stories, chilling as they are, cannot fill the void left by the truth. And so we are left with what we do know. A woman danced beneath the gaslight. She raised a daughter on hope and borrowed coin. She died alone in a locked room, and the world moved on without her. Onya kachet fut el shach. Yohanam, Huchim, Kiluxnacham Ka, Kilim, Morubu, as folk winds Bekfur. But now, nearly 2 centuries later, the current of her story is rising again. Subtle, persistent, demanding to be heard. Harriet Buzzwell does not need our pity. She needs our recognition. She needs to be written back into the ledger of lives that mattered. The project looked to have been dismal, but it hasn't yet. So, imagine then a new kind of Christmas morning, not one marked by silence and fear, but by remembrance. Imagine someone walking past number 12 Great Coram Street and stopping, not because they see a plaque or a headline, but because they feel something, a presence, a pull, the history beneath their feet. And in that moment, Harriet lives again, not as a victim, not as a mystery, but as a woman who dared to exist on her own terms in a world built to erase her. As